Welcome to Clandestine Cases, where captivating stories and mysteries come to life. Make sure to subscribe and join us on this exciting journey of suspense and intrigue. We'd love to hear your thoughts on how we can improve our content. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from around the world. Your feedback means a lot to us. Miss Marple and the Well of Secrets. Chapter 1. The Gathering at the Well. It was one of those afternoons when the air hung thick and motionless, the kind of heat that made the village dogs lie flat on the cobbled streets, and the farmers paused their work to wipe sweat from their brows. The sky had taken on a yellowed, sleepy hue, and not a single leaf stirred in the hedgerows. It was the sort of day when nothing was meant to happen. And yet, something had. A scream, high and shrill, tore through the oppressive silence, sending a ripple of unease through Little Darbury. It came from the outskirts of the village, from the old well that stood just beyond the last row of cottages. Though rarely used now, it had once been a lifeline, and some still ventured there when their own pumps faltered. Mrs. Wilkins was the first to arrive. A stout woman, with an apron perpetually dusted in flour, she was the type who thrived on minor village dramas, missing chickens, misplaced spectacles, and the ever-present question of who might be stepping out with whom. But nothing in her lifetime had prepared her for what she saw that afternoon. Her scream was loud enough to send birds scattering from the nearby hedges, for there, hanging from the broad, low branch of the ancient oak that loomed over the well, were two figures, two young black girls, their bodies swaying ever so slightly in the faintest breeze. Their limbs hung limp, their heads tilted at unnatural angles, their dark hair falling across still unseeing faces. For a moment, Mrs. Wilkins simply stared, unable to move, unable to breathe. Then, with a hand pressed to her heaving chest, she stumbled back, turned on her heel, and ran towards the village. Within minutes, the narrow dirt path leading to the well was crowded with villagers. They came in clusters, some whispering, some gasping, others merely standing in stunned silence. People pushed forward for a better look, only to recoil almost instantly, the reality of what they were seeing settling over them like a heavy, suffocating blanket. A crime? Here? In Little Darbury? Unthinkable. Someone had already rushed to fetch Sergeant Fletcher, the local constable, who arrived puffing slightly from exertion. He was a broad-shouldered man with a thick moustache and a reputation for handling missing livestock better than actual police work. Even so, he immediately took control of the scene, or at least attempted to. "Back, all of you," he barked, waving his arms in an authoritative manner. "No need to crowd now." But the villagers did not move. It was then that Inspector Caldwell arrived. Tall, gaunt, with hollow cheeks and deep-set eyes, Caldwell carried himself with the air of a man who had seen too much and cared too little. He stepped onto the scene with a bored expression, his gaze sweeping over the gathered villagers, then to the bodies. He barely paused before pulling out a small notebook. "Suicide, I imagine," he said briskly. A murmur of discomfort swept through the crowd. Sergeant Fletcher, who had been frowning at the bodies with a rare display of thoughtfulness, hesitated. "Sir," he ventured, rubbing a hand over his moustache, "I'd say this looks a bit peculiar." "Nothing peculiar about a tragedy," Caldwell remarked, scribbling something onto the page with a flick of his wrist. A few villagers exchanged uncertain glances. Two girls, both so young, found hanging from a tree near a forgotten well. It did not sit right. It was at that moment that Miss Jane Marple arrived. She had not meant to come. She had, in fact, been settled comfortably in her niece's cottage, enjoying the relative peace that came with a hot cup of tea and an afternoon spent knitting. She had been working on a particularly delicate pattern, Roses with just the right amount of detail to be interesting, but not so much as to be frustrating. But then she had heard the commotion outside. Miss Marple had learned, over the years, to trust the instinct that told her when something was amiss. And so, setting aside her knitting with a practiced motion, she had gathered her shawl, slipped into her sturdy walking shoes, and followed the sounds of hurried footsteps. Now standing at the edge of the gathered villagers, she took in the scene with a quiet intensity. Miss Marple had always known that people tended to see what they were expected to see. Two girls hanged in a quiet village. A terrible accident, a moment of despair, a simple tragedy. She had no doubt that was what Inspector Caldwell saw, but Miss Marple saw something else entirely. She saw the way the rope had been tied, the way the bodies had been positioned, the odd disturbance in the dry, cracked dirt beneath the tree. She noted the distance of the well from the hanging branch, and the way the air seemed thick with more than just grief. It carried unease, an unspoken dread, the kind that came when something had gone very, very wrong. Inspector Caldwell had already begun to turn away, snapping his notebook shut with a decisive click. "Nothing more to be done here," he said. Miss Marple's gentle blue eyes remained fixed on the bodies. There was something very, very wrong, and she intended to find out exactly what it was. Chapter 2. The Curious Marks. The process of lowering the bodies was a slow and careful one, made all the more awkward by the unnatural stillness of the victims. Sergeant Fletcher, red-faced with exertion, directed two constables as they worked the knots, their gloved hands trembling slightly as they loosened the nooses. The old oak's gnarled branches groaned under the shifting weight, and at last the two lifeless forms were gently placed onto the ground. The crowd pressed forward, murmurs of grief and disbelief rippling through them, but a sharp bark from Inspector Caldwell sent them retreating a step. "Give them space," he snapped, his usual indifference giving way to irritation. He took a perfunctory glance at the bodies, a mere flick of his gaze, and turned to face the onlookers. "Anyone know them?" For a long moment, there was silence, broken only by the rustling of wind through the grass, and the muffled sob of someone in the crowd. Then a voice, low, thick with grief, cut through the quiet. "They are my daughters." The crowd parted instinctively as a man and woman stepped forward. William and Eleanor Grayson. They were well known in the village, quiet, hard-working, and never ones to involve themselves in unnecessary disputes. They lived in a small cottage at the edge of Little Darbury, near the fields where William worked as a farmhand. Their daughters, Isabella and Ruth, were often seen helping their mother with the washing or walking into town for supplies. Now their young faces were frozen in something terrible, not quite fear, not quite peace. Eleanor gripped her husband's arm tightly, her entire body trembling as she stared down at her daughters. "They went to fetch water from the well," she whispered. That's all they went for." Her voice trembled, not with uncertainty, but with something else. Certainty, finality. Miss Marple, who had been watching quietly from the edge of the crowd, looked up sharply. There was something in the way Eleanor had spoken that struck her. A mother's grief, yes, but also a mother's knowing. She did not believe her daughters had taken their own lives. And neither did Miss Marple. The moment the bodies had been lowered, the villagers had begun to shift, many of them uncomfortable, whispering among themselves. The shock was still thick in the air, but there was another undercurrent, something unspoken, something that only a few would dare say aloud. Two girls, so young, what could drive them to such despair? Poor things, they must have had no hope left. But why? Why would they do it? Inspector Caldwell had heard enough of these murmurs, it seemed. because he snapped his notebook shut with an air of finality. "Tragic business," he said. "Most unfortunate. But suicide is—" "It was not suicide," Eleanor cut in suddenly, her voice taut with restrained fury. The crowd stilled. William, standing beside her, nodded grimly. "My daughters would not have done this. Someone—" He swallowed hard. "Someone did this to them." Inspector Caldwell exhaled through his nose. "I understand that this is a difficult time," he said, "but emotions do not change fact. These young women were found hanged. There are no signs of struggle, no visible wounds to suggest otherwise." "There are signs," Eleanor said, her voice sharp with grief. "You're simply not looking for them." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing. That was the moment she chose to step forward. She moved with a quiet, unassuming grace, as though she belonged in the background, a gentle figure, small and harmless to those who did not know better. But her mind, sharp as ever, had already begun to assemble the pieces. Something was very wrong. Her sharp blue eyes swept the ground, taking in every detail that others had overlooked. And then she saw it. The earth beneath the tree was dry and cracked, as one would expect during such a warm season. The villagers had trampled parts of it, but certain marks had not been disturbed, marks that had been there before the crowd arrived. Most people would not have noticed them. But Miss Marple did. Her keen eyes traced the subtle indentation of footprints, the kind left behind not by farm workers, nor by villagers accustomed to simple boots and worn shoes. These were heavier prints, distinct in shape. They had been made by a sole with a reinforced heel with a sharp, defined edge, a military boot, or police-issued footwear. Miss Marple pursed her lips. This was no suicide. This was a carefully staged crime. She glanced at the rope used on the girls, examining the knots, noting the way the weight had been distributed. They had not climbed the tree themselves, they had been placed there. And whoever had done it had stood here on the ground below, their footprints still visible in the undisturbed dust of the well's edge. A cold certainty settled in her stomach. Somewhere in the distance, a crow cawed, its cry long and mournful. Miss Marple straightened. She had no doubts now. This was not suicide. This was murder. And someone in Little Darby had gone to great lengths to make sure it looked like something else. Miss Marple took one last look at the grieving parents, at the unmoving forms of Isabella and Ruth, before turning her gaze to Inspector Caldwell. His face remained unreadable, but she noticed the way he shifted slightly as if suddenly eager to leave. She made a note of it. Something was not right. And as always, she intended to find out exactly what it was. Chapter 3. The Inspector's Conclusion. 2 days had passed since the bodies of Isabella and Ruth Grayson were found hanging from the old oak near the well, and yet the village of Little Darby had not settled. If anything, the unease had deepened, like the hush before a storm. People whispered in corners, speaking in hushed, hurried tones whenever a member of law enforcement passed. It was the sort of gossip soaked in fear, not idle curiosity. The post-mortem report arrived that morning, hand-delivered by a grim-faced constable who said nothing, as he handed it to Inspector Caldwell. The inspector had read it, nodded to himself, and, with an air of finality, had declared the case closed. Suicide, the report stated, no external injuries beyond those consistent with hanging. Cause of death, self-inflicted asphyxiation. The words felt as hollow as the inspector's indifference. Miss Marple sat in her usual chair at her niece's cottage, the report spread neatly before her on the tea table. She read it twice, slowly, her pale blue eyes flickering with something between frustration and resignation. Then she sighed, a small, weary sound, but one that carried the weight of something deeper. Outside, the village bustled with its usual routines, yet beneath it was a palpable tension. The tragedy had sent a ripple through the community, leaving something unspoken lingering in the air, a question no one dared ask outright. Had there been a murderer among them? Miss Marple had no doubt. She had watched the inspector's announcement with quiet interest that afternoon, standing among the gathered villagers as he had delivered the verdict, with the brisk detachment of a man eager to be done with an unpleasant duty. "Unfortunate, yes, but these things do happen," Caldwell had said, dusting his hands as if physically ridding himself of the case. There had been a moment of silence as the crowd absorbed the words. Then came the murmurs. Confusion, doubt. A young boy clutched his mother's skirts, his wide eyes peeking out as she murmured something to her neighbor. A farmer shifted uneasily, rubbing the back of his neck as though the afternoon heat had suddenly become unbearable. But it was Eleanor Grayson who spoke first. She stood at the front, her face pale, but her voice firm, unwavering. "Our daughters would not have done this," she said. Her voice did not waver, though grief sat thick in her throat. She turned to the inspector, her dark eyes burning with something raw and unrelenting. "You are wrong," she said, "and I will not rest until the truth is known." Inspector Caldwell had offered a long, suffering sigh, clearly unimpressed with a grieving mother's persistence. "Mrs. Grayson," he had said, "I understand this is a difficult time, but the facts do not change simply because we wish them to." Eleanor's hands had clenched into fists at her sides. "The facts," she echoed bitterly. "Do you even know what they are?" A tension had settled over the crowd, the villagers shifting uncomfortably. No one was willing to argue with the police, not openly, and yet doubt lingered in their expressions. Miss Marple had watched it all with keen interest, her gaze lingering on Inspector Caldwell's expression. Not quite impatience, not quite irritation. No, there was something else there, something calculated. Something she had seen before in men who wished to push a matter aside too quickly. She had also noticed the way he had avoided looking directly at the bodies during the investigation, how he had not examined them closely before giving his verdict. That, in itself, had been very telling indeed. Now, back in the small sitting room, Miss Marple set the report aside, her fingers tracing the rim of her china teacup. The floral pattern had faded over time, the delicate edges chipped from years of careful use. Much like the truth, she thought, a delicate thing too easily broken. She had seen the bodies up close. No external injuries. Miss Marple's brow furrowed slightly. She had seen the bruises beneath their collars, the odd discoloration on their wrists, faint but unmistakable shadows of force applied before death. She had not forgotten the way their hands had lain unnaturally limp, not clenched, not grasping at rope in their last moments. It was wrong. It did not match. Something had been done to those girls before they were hanged. And then there was the matter of the footprints. Heavy, deliberate prints just off to the side of where the tree roots met the hard-packed earth. Not the scuff marks of a desperate girl struggling in her final moments, but something far more controlled, intentional. Military or police-issue boots. Miss Marple's fingers tightened around the handle of her cup. That too had been overlooked, or rather, ignored. Her lips pressed into a thin line. She had spent years understanding people, their motives, their mistakes. She had seen grief, hatred, fear, and guilt written plainly across the faces of those who had something to hide. And Inspector Caldwell's face had given her much to consider. She set her cup down with a quiet clink and rose from her chair. There was someone she needed to visit. Someone who would not dismiss her concerns with a flick of the wrist. Someone who, despite grief, might see the world as she did. Eleanor Grayson. If the police were determined to close this case, then it was up to Miss Marple to find the truth on her own. And she intended to do just that. Chapter 4. Secrets in the Village. The Grayson cottage stood at the far edge of Little Darbury, where the land began to stretch toward open fields and distant woodlands. It was a humble dwelling, whitewashed walls slightly weathered by time, but the small garden out front was neat, with a row of carefully tended lavender bushes lining the path to the door. Miss Marple had always admired the Graysons. They were a hard-working family, polite but private, never ones to stir trouble. And yet trouble had found them. Today the house bore an unmistakable weight of grief. The curtains were drawn halfway, casting long shadows over the sitting room, and the air inside was thick and still, as if the very walls were mourning. Eleanor Grayson sat by the small window, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her gaze unfocused. Across from her, William stood by the fireplace, shoulders squared, chin lifted, but there was a tension in his stance, as though holding together a grief too large to express. Miss Marple, always a figure of gentle composure, took the seat that Eleanor gestured toward. She placed her handbag neatly upon her lap, folding her hands over it. It was a moment before she spoke. "My dear," she said softly, "tell me everything you can about that night." Eleanor's fingers tightened over the fabric of her dress, her knuckles paling. She inhaled slowly, as though bracing herself for a memory too painful to revisit. "They had gone to the well," she murmured. "That's all, just to fetch water." Her voice, though calm, carried an underlying strain, the kind that comes when grief has not yet settled, but still roams restlessly through the heart. "We waited for them," she continued, "but they never came back." A pause. Then, her voice faltered. "Then someone came running, told us to come at once." William turned from the fireplace then, his face lined with exhaustion and something else, something deeper than grief. "When we got there," he said, his voice rough, "we already knew. Before we saw them, we knew." Eleanor nodded, pressing a trembling hand to her lips. "A mother knows," she whispered. Miss Marple, with a quiet sympathy, inclined her head. It was true, she thought. A mother does know. She let the silence settle for a moment, then asked the question that had been waiting on her tongue. "And you believe, without a doubt, that they were murdered?" Eleanor lifted her gaze then, and Miss Marple saw fire in her eyes. "Of course," she said fiercely, "my daughters were happy. They were not the sort to—" She swallowed hard. "To do such a thing." Her voice was shaking, but not with uncertainty, with fury. Miss Marple observed her carefully. There was no hesitation, no wavering in her belief. Not all grief-stricken parents were so certain. But Eleanor Grayson was not simply mourning. She was determined. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "They were frightened," Eleanor said suddenly, her voice quieter now, but heavy with meaning. Miss Marple's interest sharpened. "Frightened?" she echoed. Eleanor nodded, her grip on the chair's armrest tightening. "Ruth told me the night before," she whispered. "She thought someone was following them." Miss Marple's spine stiffened ever so slightly. "Following them?" she repeated. "Yes," Eleanor murmured. "She thought she saw a man, watching them from the trees near the well." Miss Marple felt a cold prickle at the back of her neck. "A man?" She kept her voice calm even. "A man?" she asked. "Did she say what he looked like?" Eleanor hesitated. "No," she admitted. She only caught glimpses, but she said he was tall, and he moved like a soldier. A soldier? Or a policeman? Miss Marple sat back, her expression carefully composed. Outside, the wind had begun to stir the trees, their branches creaking faintly, the sound echoing through the quiet house. The police had dismissed the case so quickly, too quickly. A mother and father who knew their daughters had been murdered. A figure lurking in the shadows. A post-mortem report that did not match the truth. And a police inspector who had no interest in asking questions. Miss Marple tapped her fingers lightly against the clasp of her handbag, her mind moving with precise efficiency. There was a lie woven into this case, and she had an uneasy suspicion of who had spun it. It was time to visit the hospital. If the body tells the truth, and the report tells a lie, then somewhere between them lay the answer. Miss Marple rose gracefully, offering Eleanor a gentle pat on the hand. "I will do everything I can," she promised. Eleanor blinked rapidly as though fighting tears she had not yet allowed herself to shed, and simply nodded. Miss Marple turned to William. His jaw was set, his eyes dark. "Find who did this," he said simply. Miss Marple, who had already begun to piece together the shape of a terrible truth, gave him a small nod. And then, with her usual quiet, unassuming elegance, she stepped into the afternoon light, walking toward the next clue. Chapter 5. The Doctor's Lie. The hospital in Little Darbury was an unassuming place, a modest white-bricked building with an air of quiet neglect. The garden at the front, though once tended with care, had begun to fray at the edges, ivy creeping unchecked along the stonework, weeds pushing stubbornly through the flower beds. Hospitals, Miss Marple reflected, were places of truth and deception in equal measure. Here, life and death were catalogued, signed off in neat handwriting, reduced to clinical facts on a report. And yet, as she well knew, reports could lie. And so could doctors. She arrived in the late afternoon, when the light had turned honey gold. Slanting lazily through the tall windows of the quiet corridors, the nurses were preoccupied with paperwork, moving about with efficient disinterest, and no one paid much mind to an elderly lady wandering at her own pace. Miss Marple had always known how to become invisible. Her presence, small, genteel, with a faint air of harmless curiosity, was something few took seriously enough to question. And yet, she had learned long ago that people revealed more when they thought no one was watching. Dr. Edmund Caldwell's office was at the end of the corridor, tucked away from the busier wards. A brass nameplate gleamed dully on the door. She knocked, and after a brief pause, a thin, reedy voice called out, "Yes." "Come in." She stepped inside. Dr. Caldwell was a wiry man, his pale complexion suggesting he saw little of daylight. His hair was thinning, neatly combed, and his watery blue eyes blinked at her in mild surprise. "Ah," he said, rising from behind his desk, "Miss Marple, isn't it?" His politeness was practiced, his movements a touch too controlled, as if he were already weighing how much to say and how much to conceal. Miss Marple smiled pleasantly, the sort of warm, grandmotherly smile that had disarmed many a guilty man before him. "I had some questions about the post-mortem report," she said lightly, lowering herself into a chair without waiting to be asked. Dr. Caldwell hesitated for the briefest moment before smoothing his hands over the stack of papers before him. "Of course," he said, "but I assure you everything was done correctly." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled pleasantly. "Oh, I'm sure," she said, her tone entirely agreeable. "I'm sure you did everything you were told to do." A tiny flicker of something crossed Dr. Caldwell's face, not quite alarm, but something adjacent to it. Miss Marple continued, her voice light, conversational. "It must be rather difficult," she mused, "having a brother in the police, or that expectation or that pressure." Dr. Caldwell's jaw twitched, just a small movement, but Miss Marple caught it. She tilted her head slightly as though merely chatting over tea. "You see, my dear," she said, I do find it quite puzzling that a report would state there were no external injuries, when I myself saw the bruises." Dr. Caldwell's fingers curled slightly against the desk. "I'm sure you must have been mistaken," he said lightly. Miss Marple tutted, shaking her head. "That would be most unlike me," she said. A tense silence settled between them. Dr. Caldwell's throat moved as he swallowed, his eyes darting briefly to the door, before returning to her. Then quite suddenly he stood. "I have other patients to see," he said briskly, straightening his coat. "I'm afraid I must ask you to leave." Miss Marple remained seated for a moment, observing the faint tremor in his hands as he reached for his pen. She rose gracefully, adjusting the strap of her handbag. "Of course, dear," she said, her voice as mild as ever. "One wouldn't want to keep a doctor from his duties." She turned, moving toward the door, but paused briefly before exiting. "You know," she said airily, "I always find it fascinating, the way people behave when they know something they shouldn't. The little signs, a nervous glance, the way their hands shake just slightly, the way they move a conversation along just a bit too quickly." She turned her head ever so slightly, catching the way Dr. Caldwell's posture stiffened. "A doctor's duty," she murmured, "is to tell the truth." And then she left. In the quiet corridor, Miss Marple walked with a calm, unhurried step, but inside her thoughts were moving at a sharp and decisive pace. Dr. Caldwell was lying. That much was abundantly clear, but why? Had he altered the post-mortem report on his own? Or had he been coerced into doing so? And if so, by whom? She had a very good idea. Outside, the last of the evening light was fading into soft indigo, the edges of the sky tinged with violet and ember. Miss Marple paused at the hospital gates, taking a slow breath. There was still much to uncover, but she had no doubt. The truth was unraveling, and soon someone in Little Darbury would find themselves caught in the web of their own deceit. Chapter 6. A Sinister History. Miss Marple stepped out of the hospital's white-bricked entrance, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows along the quiet lane. Her mind, as ever, was whirring with careful precision, like the delicate movements of a well-maintained clock. Dr. Caldwell had lied. She had seen it in the way his fingers curled slightly against his desk, in the tension in his voice, and in his brisk dismissal of her polite inquiries. It was not simply the evasions of a man caught off guard, it was something deeper, something deliberate. And Miss Marple knew well that lies were never without purpose. As she stepped onto the narrow, cobbled path, her feet carried her almost by instinct, not back toward her niece's cottage, but toward the heart of the village, toward a place where secrets lay dormant, waiting for the right pair of hands to turn the pages of the past. The village archives. If there was a history to be uncovered, it would be found there. The archives of Little Darbury were not grand, not like those of St. Mary Mead or larger towns, but they had been kept dutifully over the decades. It was a small, dust-laden office tucked away beside the church, its walls lined with leather-bound ledgers and yellowed newspapers, the air thick with the scent of old ink and aged paper. Miss Marple entered with the grace of someone who belonged anywhere she chose to be, her expression mild, but her purpose razor-sharp. Behind a large wooden desk the curator sat, a thin man with sharp eyes, a pointed nose, and an unfortunate fondness for peppermint sweets, which he now popped into his mouth with practiced ease. He blinked at her presence, his expression shifting to polite curiosity. "Something I can help you with, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple smiled, warm and unassuming. "Oh, just a bit of research, dear," she said, removing her gloves with a delicate motion. "About an old name in the village. The Caldwell family." The curator's expression flickered with something that was not quite surprise, not quite discomfort. "The Caldwells," he repeated. Miss Marple inclined her head gently. The man huffed, already rifling through a stack of old ledgers, muttering as he did so. "Oh, that lot," he said, shaking his head. "Been here for, generations. But the real trouble started with the father, Major Caldwell. Nasty piece of work by all accounts." Miss Marple's knitting needles clinked gently in her handbag. "Trouble?" she echoed, her voice light but inviting. The curator snorted, pulling out a dusty volume and flipping it open. "Before my time, but I've heard the stories," he said. "The Major was one of those men who, well, let's say he had no fondness for people who weren't his kind." Miss Marple's lips pursed ever so slightly, though her tone remained pleasantly conversational. "And by that," she said mildly, "you mean he was involved in certain anti-black movements?" The curator hesitated, then cast a quick glance over his shoulder, as if fearful of unseen ears. "More than involved," he muttered. "He was one of the leaders of that wretched group, stirring up trouble, saying black folk didn't belong in the village. Rallies, threats, intimidation. He was careful enough to keep it all just within the law. Never got himself arrested, but people knew." He gave a dry chuckle, though it held no humor. "Of course, after the war things changed. The world changed. He went quiet, but folks never forgot." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes sharp with understanding. A man who had hated black people, a son who had joined the police force, a cover-up that was all too convenient. She could see it now, the pattern weaving itself together. The murder of Isabella and Ruth Grayson was not merely a crime. It was an echo of an old hatred, one that had festered, one that had been waiting for an opportunity to strike again. And Miss Marple had no doubt that the sins of the father had not died with him. She glanced back at the curator, who had settled back into his chair, rubbing at his temples as though unearthing these memories had brought back an old headache. She smiled sweetly. "You have been very helpful," she said. The curator blinked, as if surprised by the compliment. "Oh," he muttered. "Well, glad to be of assistance." Miss Marple adjusted the strap of her handbag, nodding politely before turning to leave. Outside, the evening air was cooler, the sky fading into a dusky lavender hue. She walked at a measured pace, but her thoughts were moving swiftly, precisely. This was not just murder, this was a crime of hate, one carefully orchestrated and concealed, and she knew exactly where to go next. Chapter 7. A Murderer Exposed. The police station in Little Darbury was a small, nondescript building, the kind that had never been needed for much more than the occasional case of stolen livestock or a drunken scuffle after a village fete. It had never borne witness to a crime such as this, and yet today it seemed to loom over the square, its unassuming brick facade concealing something dark and unspoken. Miss Marple approached the station with measured steps, her handbag neatly tucked in the crook of her arm, her expression one of quiet determination. She had walked through many doors in her time, sat across from many guilty men, and she recognized the shape of a mind scrambling to hold itself together. Inside, the air was stale with paper and ink, the tick of a clock too loud in the silence. The constable at the desk gave her a quick, wary glance before nodding toward the back office. Inspector Caldwell sat at his desk, his long fingers drumming impatiently against the wood. He did not look up immediately, but when he did, his expression barely masked his irritation. "You again," he muttered. Miss Marple smiled pleasantly, her presence as calm and unhurried as ever. "My dear Inspector," she said mildly, lowering herself into the chair opposite him, "I do believe I've solved your case." Caldwell's brows lifted just slightly, but his bored expression did not change. "Have you now?" Miss Marple nodded, fingering the clasp of her handbag, her voice never rising above a gentle, conversational tone. "You see," she said, "I have been looking into things. The history of this village, the history of your own family, Inspector. And I must say it does make for a rather dreadful story." For the first time, a flicker of something dangerous crossed Caldwell's face. A hesitation. A shadow of something buried deep. Miss Marple continued, her words soft but unrelenting. "It must have been quite difficult for you," she mused, "growing up under a father like Major Caldwell. A man who, how shall I put it, believed in keeping the village a certain way. And I imagine you felt the same, didn't you?" Caldwell's jaw tightened, his fingers pressing down just a little too hard against the desk. "You're talking nonsense, old woman." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, her expression almost curious. "But I wonder," she went on, "was it simply hatred that made you do it? Or was it something else? A personal slight, perhaps?" Silence. The room felt smaller. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her hands folding neatly in her lap. "I spoke with Eleanor Grayson," she said, "and she told me something quite interesting, that a few days before her daughters were killed, her husband had an argument." "With you?" Caldwell's fingers curled on the desk, his posture stiffening. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "And then there is the matter of the post-mortem," she added, "conducted by none other than your own brother? A most convenient arrangement, wouldn't you say?" Caldwell's eyes flashed, but he remained silent. "You have no proof," he said finally, his voice low and controlled. Miss Marple sighed softly as though chiding a misbehaving child. "My dear boy, I have quite enough," she said gently. She ticked off her points with quiet precision. The bruises hidden beneath the girls' collars, the distinct shoe prints at the crime scene, the kind only worn by the police or military. And of course your little visit to the well that night. "You just happened to cross paths with two black girls," she murmured, "girls whose father you had argued with, girls you thought no one would miss." Caldwell's face darkened, his hands clenching into fists. "Shut up," he muttered. Miss Marple remained seated, entirely calm. "But I do know," she said, her voice like silk, covering steel. "And so do the constables outside this door, who have been listening to your every word." A beat of silence. Then, the door swung open, and two stern-faced officers stepped inside. Caldwell froze, his mouth tightening. Miss Marple smiled ever so slightly, her voice still warm, almost motherly. "It's over, Inspector," she said. "Hatred has no place in justice." For a moment, Caldwell did not move, did not breathe. Then, with a bitter laugh, he muttered, "Those girls should never have been here in the first place." It was a confession in every way that mattered. The officers stepped forward, their grips firm as they reached for him. Caldwell did not struggle, but his face was twisted with something ugly, something that had been festering for far too long. As they led him away, Miss Marple exhaled softly, smoothing the crease in her skirt. The case, it seemed, was finally closed. She rose, collected her handbag, and stepped out into the quiet village evening, where the air was lighter than it had been in days. And with a measured grace, she began the walk home. Chapter 8. Justice and Tea. The village was quiet in the aftermath. News of Inspector Caldwell's arrest had spread quickly, moving through the narrow lanes and clustered cottages like the final peal of a long-overdue church bell. Some villagers expressed disbelief. After all, he had been their lawman for years, a presence they had come to accept as simply part of Little Darbury. Others, however, were less surprised, exchanging knowing glances, recalling whispers from years past, memories of his father, Major Caldwell, and the bitterness that ran in his bloodline like an inherited illness. The Graysons, grieving yet unbowed, mourned their daughters in a way that no parent should ever have to. But this time, their grief was met with justice, not silence. There would be no quiet burial of truth, no whispered apologies or glances that turned away in awkward discomfort. This time, the village had listened. And justice, slow though it had been, had finally come. Dr. Edmund Caldwell, too, found himself summoned from his comfortable office. His hands had always been steady with a scalpel, but they trembled when the authorities came for him. Falsifying reports, obstructing justice, there was no avoiding the weight of his own complicity. The villagers watched as he was led away, not with the same shock that had met his brother's arrest, but with a quiet, grim acknowledgement. After all, there were those who committed murder, and there were those who helped to cover it up. Both, Miss Marple thought, were equally deserving of their fate, and as for Miss Marple, she walked home at a measured pace, the evening air crisp but not unkind, the scent of damp leaves and distant chimney smoke mingling as she neared her niece's cottage. She had been away from her knitting for too long. The small sitting room welcomed her with its familiar, comfortable clutter, the half-knitted tea cozy draped over the armrest, the book she had been meaning to finish, the faintest scent of lavender from a sachet tucked in the drawer of the writing desk. On the side table, a freshly brewed pot of tea awaited her, the steam curling into the air in gentle, delicate wisps. She lowered herself into her well-worn chair, sighing ever so slightly as she settled in, her fingers reaching instinctively for the soft wool of her knitting project. For a moment, she simply watched the firelight dance against the porcelain rim of her teacup, her sharp blue eyes reflecting the flicker of something softer, more thoughtful. She had seen many things in her lifetime. People often assumed that evil announced itself boldly with a villain's sneer or the dramatic flourish of a criminal act. But Miss Marple had long since learned that true evil was quiet. It was in the small things, the overlooked details, the hatred that settled into a person's bones and passed from generation to generation. And yet so, too, was justice. It was in the persistence of those who would not let the truth be buried. In the way a single voice, no matter how small, could unravel the tightest of lies. She took a deliberate sip of her tea, the warmth spreading through her fingers, through the worn china, and into her hands. Yes, she thought, evil had a way of creeping into the most ordinary places, but so too did justice. And that, she decided, was something worth knitting for. Synopsis: Miss Marple and the Shadows, by the Well. In the quiet village of Little Darbury, a horrifying discovery shatters the peace. The bodies of two young black sisters, Isabella and Ruth Grayson, are found hanging from an old oak tree near the village well. The local authorities, led by Inspector Caldwell, are quick to rule their deaths as suicide, dismissing any suggestion of foul play. But Miss Jane Marple, visiting her niece in the village, is not so easily convinced. With her keen eye for detail and deep understanding of human nature, she notices inconsistencies, the telltale signs of bruises hidden beneath their collars, the disturbed earth near the well, and most curiously, shoe prints belonging to someone in a position of authority. Determined to uncover the truth hidden beneath layers of prejudice and deception, Miss Marple begins her quiet but unrelenting investigation. As she speaks with the grieving parents, she learns that the girls had been frightened before their deaths, believing someone had been watching them. Her inquiries lead her to the village archives, where she uncovers a sinister history, one that ties the case directly to Caldwell's own family. Major Caldwell, the inspector's late father, had been a well-known figure in a violent anti-black movement, stirring hatred and division in the community. Though his time had passed, it becomes clear that his ideology lived on in his son. Miss Marple pieces together the chilling reality. Inspector Caldwell murdered the two girls, disguising it as suicide, and enlisted his brother, Dr. Edmund Caldwell, to falsify the post-mortem report to erase any trace of the crime. In a final confrontation at the police station, Miss Marple, with her usual sharp wit and quiet authority, lays out the evidence piece by piece, exposing the motive, the cover-up, and the damning proof of Caldwell's presence at the scene of the crime. With the constables listening in, Caldwell is finally forced to confess, his hatred and guilt spilling out in a bitter, venomous declaration. He and his brother are arrested, ensuring that the Grayson family receives the justice they deserve. With the case solved, Miss Marple returns to her cozy cottage, where a warm pot of tea and her half-knitted tea cozy await her. As she sips her tea, she reflects on a truth she has come to understand all too well, that evil often hides in the most ordinary places, but so too does justice.